It is yellow, so now it's green. Very good. All right, this is my wife, Brenda.
Morning.
And I tell people, so my wife has an interesting ancestry. On one side of her family, she's hillbilly, and on the other side of her family, she's Amish. So, so I got the best of both worlds. Anyway, we have. Anyway, Brenda and I met at Bethel College up in Mishawaka, Indiana, back in the 1990s. I was her Old Testament professor, and she was a student. But we met working at a church together, and we've been married for 27 years now, have 2 kids, and one's 26, right? That's how I know how long we've been married. It was one more year, and then we have a son who's 17, going to be finishing up high school next year. But she had a list of announcements, and I thought, why don't you just come do them, because she probably explained them better than me anyway. So, Brenda, why don't you tell us a few things that would be good for folks to know?
Okay, and I may have you give some detail on these. But I've had a lot of questions at the book table, and I just want to help you guys connect so that you can get more resources and get connected to people in your area if you're needing help or want to send people for help. So the first thing I want to highlight is if you go to our website for our organization, it's deeperwalkinternational.org. There's a lot there. There's free resources, including we have an institute. It's not accredited, but you can go through 3 courses. The first course is free, online, streaming, and there's free downloadable PDFs. So if you want to hear more of the kind of teaching that Marcus does, that first course is free. I'll let you talk more about institutes and journey groups. Also, if you go there, there's a tab that just talks about events, and also you can sign up for free webinars, or sometimes there's for-pay webinars. We have a lot of guest speakers. There's a place to sign up for our e-newsletter. I would highly suggest that you guys do that, because it's through that method that we're able to let you know where Marcus is going to be speaking. And I know that it's in the works right now. 3 different churches just in the Fort Wayne area are having him back in sometime this year to speak on different topics. One of them is going to be on learning the method of a manual prayer. Another one is going to be understanding the wounded heart. And those will most likely be Saturday seminars. And if you're on Facebook, like us on Facebook, because our executive director loves to put out what's coming up next on Facebook. And also there's a referral page. So people were coming up and saying, does Marcus meet with people? And right now he is really busy on the road training and trying to train the church to help other people. And so, but we do have a referral network there. Also Freedom in Christ Ministries has a lot of people who will sit with people and take them through the steps to freedom. So, and there's also a way to communicate with us there if you want to shoot us an email.
All right,
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So sometimes they're easier to hear announcements from a pretty face. So, so thank you, Brenda. Today we're going to be talking about community and the role of community. We've been talking about kingdom living and how do we move boldly and aggressively into the kingdom. And today, I'm unfortunately don't seem to have my PowerPoint, but we introduced earlier this week the word Hesed, right? Hesed, and talked about it like sticky love. So let me give you a further picture of Hesed to get started. My colleague and something of a mentor is Jim Wilder, and Jim has and I have been able to partner together in ministry, but he's about 10 years older than I am, and he's got a lot of life experience and just a brilliant guy, and I love to learn from him. And we've been talking a lot about Hesed and what does this look like. And he told me a story to try to explain it. He said he was working at a summer camp a few years back, now probably 40 years. He was a teenager at the time. This was a summer camp where people who lived in like inner city Chicago could get away and get out in the country for a while. And you know the benefits of periodically getting away from that kind of life into something a little slower paced. And this camp, this particular week, was for senior citizens. And there was an interesting time this week because there was one person there who was just ruining the camp experience for everybody. You ever had one of those where you come and there's just one person who is just making this a mess for everybody else? And in this particular week, it was a lady. And to give you an idea of the sort of problems that she was creating, they had two lines for servers. One for getting your food. They'd ring a bell, ding, 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 and it was time to come eat. And one line of the seniors who could walk without a walker was on one side, and those who needed a walker was on the other side. And this lady was notorious for running to the front of the line, kicking over all of the walkers, and grabbing her food without a thank you, sitting down, eating it as fast as she could, and leaving. So she wasn't making a lot of friends, okay? And on top of that, she was just incredibly ungrateful. She was incredibly demanding. She was feisty about everything, and she refused to take a bath or a shower. So you knew when she was coming about, a minute before she arrived, because the BO would arrive before she arrived, and the poor female counselors just had about enough, and about 7 of them finally just dragged her into the showers and forced her to get cleaned up. And it was a long week. So at the end of that week, Jim, he was a teenager at the time. He was sitting on a hillside watching the sunset, and an elderly gentleman sat down next to him. They began to talk, and this gentleman was very distinguished. He was a professor. He spoke 17 languages. He was fluent in several different instruments. He was a professor of philosophy. And they were just having this amazing conversation, sharing the sunset, talking about deep things, and the crazy woman goes running by. And Jim makes a comment how she'd sort of been the bane of the camp all week, and the guy hung his head and said, "Yeah, I know, that's my wife." He then proceeded to roll up his sleeve and show tattoos here from Auschwitz, where he and his wife were Jewish, and they had been imprisoned in a concentration camp where they had done experiments, including removing portions of her brain. And she was simply missing portions of her brain that were relational, that synchronized with people around her. The parts of your brain that do that sort of thing were simply missing. And he said, many people have told me I should just stick her in a home, move on with my life, but I can't, right? I love her. He's like, you should have known her when. Said she was a concert pianist, used to tour Europe giving piano concerts. She was the most gracious, hospitable person you ever wanted to meet. And Jim said to me, that is sticky love, right? That is Hesed love. And what we find here is that Hesed love is all about how you treat weakness. And one of the things that I realize, because I get asked to speak at a lot of places, I'm often in a position of leadership. I'm often in a position of, being the one telling people, what to do with their lives. And one of the things you realize is that we're all weak, right? Everybody here has weaknesses. And we all have areas where we struggle. We have all areas where we're still growing. And one of the goals of community, and God is kind of this interesting person, because I don't know if you're like me, but I remember when I was in junior high, I had this dream that, because I was a little pudgy, I was a little overweight, but I was athletic. And I had this dream that one summer I was going to go get all buff, lift weights and get in shape and show back up at school and have everybody go, wow, what happened to you, right? And It never did, but it was always this dream. And I think that a lot of us have a similar dream when it comes to our Christian faith, that somehow we're going to go off by ourselves somewhere and all on our own, we're going to figure this all out, and we're going to show up at church with it all together. And people are going to go, wow, look at you. How did you get it all together so fast? What is going on? What is your secret? And I find that it just doesn't work like that very often. Now, there are times when we go into solitude and to retreat to connect with God, and we come back with something that God wants to give us, but we rarely come back completely fixed. We come back with something new. We come back with something fresh. We come back with something that we can offer to his body, but we don't come back completely all together well. And I think God did this on purpose because God wanted us to be in community, and he wanted us to be in community where we could share our weaknesses with other people and have those people deal tenderly with our weaknesses and help us grow. Because one of the problems that happens in churches everywhere that I go is they do something I call king-making. King-making. King-making happens when you say to the lead pastor, you know what, I know God's called you. I know God's anointed you. I know that you know the Word. I know that you have the Spirit. I know, what God's doing in your life. So tell you what, let's just give you all the responsibility, and we'll sit back and applaud you and give you money and say good job. And there's way too many pastors who accept that deal. And when you accept that deal, what happens is you become king in your congregation. And once you become the king in your congregation, there's another problem that comes with that, and that is that you have no peers. And when you have no peers, who do you share your weakness with? And it's a problem, right? It's a problem because what Hesed is about how this idea that we are stronger together than we are individually or by ourselves. Now, you guys, frankly to me, have been a wonderful model of what community looks like in the two times that I've been able to come to this conference. I always leave feeling like I've got a little clearer picture of what it looks like because I see multi-generation, right? I see children, I see parents, I see grandparents, I see, four generations of people interacting with each other. And I'm like, I don't see that in too many churches. We keep everybody separate. I see men gathering together and willing to share with one another where they're struggling, where they're learning, what they want to learn next. Guys come up to me all the time and say, thank you so much, I'm growing. That's really helping me grow. I'm like, that's what we want from our leaders, isn't it? Right? We want leaders who are willing to say, this is where I'm growing. This is where God has me on a growth journey. I appreciate your prayers as I go through what I'm going through. I remember there was a time in our journey when, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I was a senior pastor for 7 years, and it seemed like Brenda and I only ever had fights on Saturday night. Right? Just before you're supposed to get up on Sunday morning and tell people how to be spiritual. I also found especially that shopping was not a good idea. Because we seem to have two completely different philosophies of what to do when we go shopping, right? Yeah, so, her idea of a great shopping day is let's go to this store and take a look at a couple of dresses, and then let's go to this store and take a look at a couple of dresses, and we'll have them put one on hold here, one here. Then let's go have coffee, and you can tell me what you like better about this dress than that dress, and this dress than that one. And then maybe we'll go to a third store, and then when we're done there, it's like, even if we don't buy a dress at all day, it'll be a successful shopping experience. Yeah, I know, and I'm like, you tell you what, you go shop for dresses, I'll go over here and look at the hunting guns, right? Now, we have a, I don't even hunt, so I don't know why I said that, but the point was that her goal for the day was relationship, right? Her goal for the day was relationship. Let's go and have a relational day together. Right? My goal for the day was to go hunting and gathering. You need a coat? Let's go get that coat. Let's bag it. Let's go home. I can remember the time we went into a store. She was looking for a black coat. We walked in the very first store. I said, like that one? She almost cried. Exactly what she wanted. And it took me a while to realize that what we were after when we went shopping was completely different. She went there to dream. She went there to be relational. I went there to get job done. And it would create conflict, right? It would create conflict because we couldn't both get what we wanted. And you know what the flesh does? The flesh is that part of me that just wants what I want. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad, I want it. And if you want something different than what I want, we have a flesh war now. Whose flesh is going to get what they want? And walking in the Spirit is a whole lot about crucifying that flesh and learning how to be relational with people when I'm not getting what I want. And this is one of the things that makes community so difficult. Community is easy to paint in beautiful flowing colors. Like, wouldn't it be wonderful if we all just got along, And it's easy to talk about this like, oh, it's the most wonderful thing when we're in community. But community can be hard because there's a whole lot of flesh in community because we all want different things. And the things that we want aren't, you got to decide sometimes, what am I willing to go to war over? What do I need to win about? And when do I keep the relationship bigger than the problem? And so what would happen with me, we got one particular evening, we started to have a fight right in the middle of the store. And I'm like, I'm a pastor. I probably might better have a fight with my wife in the public. We go out to the car, and we're sitting there, and I've just shut down. Hey, you guys do this? You get in a fight with your wife, you just shut down. Do not talk. There is no words coming out. And what a lot of women don't understand is the reason there are no words coming out is you are trying to protect them from the words that want to come out. They don't understand, so they poke and try to get you to talk because they've been told that talking will fix everything. And I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden, it was like the Lord said, Marcus, you knew she had issues when you married her. And I was like, amen. He said, but it's not her issues causing these problems, it's yours. And it was about that point that I told her I would agree to go get counseling. Now, it's like when a senior pastor says to his congregation, I'm about to go get some counseling because there's something broke in me. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right? I think that's a good thing. I look at it this way, that, as leaders, one of the things that we want to do as leaders is we want to model that it's okay to be weak. We want to model that it's okay not to have this all figured out, and that there isn't necessarily a biblical principle that will fix every problem that you have. And sometimes we just struggle through these things together. And we struggle because God wants us to have our people go through this with us. And it's okay. Now, it can go too far, of course. You can take your identity from your weaknesses. And that can become a problem. But I think it's good for us to model that we all have issues that we need to work on. So I look at this idea of Hesed, this idea of sticky love. This is a picture of our founder, Dr. Mark Bubeck. And he was just a gentle, wonderful man. He was quite a prayer warrior. In fact, his calling began when he was a young pastor, and he graduated from Moody Bible Institute. He got out into the pastorate. He said, you know what, I'm not sure I'm up to this. He said, and he was a good farm boy. So he got up at 4:30 every morning and he said he committed himself to at least an hour with God every morning before he started in anything else. And as he started that day in an hour with God, he often would go to the church and walk through the sanctuary and pray. And one day while he was in his church and he was praying for revival of the land, he said the presence of God just came upon him so powerfully. He found himself on his knees in the church. He said it was practically audible, this voice that came to him said, Mark, for the kind of revival to happen for which you're praying, there will have to be a powerful encounter with the adversary. It's like, this doesn't come easy. We're talking about war. Now, Mark had not had much training on spiritual warfare. He didn't know what God was talking about, and he went back, he started studying his Bible with a new perspective, and he went back down on his knees and said, Lord, spiritual warfare is on almost every page of the Bible. I don't know how I missed it. But sometimes your theological lenses can color the way you look at the Bible. And he began a ministry of care and concern and helping bring revival into this country by helping people deal with those wounded areas in their life where the enemy was keeping them stuck and in bondage, and helping them experience breakthrough and bringing this message to the church. And it was a great honor when I was asked to become the president of this organization and begin moving it forward. He passed away this year. He was almost 90. But he was a wonderful example of somebody who was committed to community and committed to family and committed to making a family out of community and reaching out to a younger generation and helping them as they make their way through. So let me give you a few what I consider 3 core goals of building a Hesed sticky love community. And the first one is that we oppose predators, which might catch you a little bit off guard. But if you're going to create a safe place for people who are weak, what is the main thing that weak people fear? Predators, right? Someone who's going to come and take advantage of their weakness and make life miserable for them. And predators can look a lot of different ways, right? You have the obvious predators who are in there trying to seduce women and, take advantage of them sexually. There's obvious predators. There are less obvious predators who are coming in. And one of the things that's characteristic of a predator is they will track all of your weaknesses. And they keep track of them in their mind so they can use them against you if you are ever, their flesh and your flesh are in conflict and they want to win. It's like, I know how to win. I'm going to bring up everything about you that's weak. Or I'm going to let people know, well, this can't be my problem. Well, hey, do you know about them? Let me tell you about them. This is really their problem. And so, if you're going to create an environment where it's safe for weak people to grow, you have to have people who are strong enough to stand up to the predators in the group. If you get into a place that is run by predators and you bring in one godly leader into that group who is being run by predators, you know what happens to the godly leader, right? He's going to get run out of town. He's going to get crucified. Because you can't always turn things around just with one godly leader. You have to create a culture of godly leadership. You have to create a culture where leaders treat weakness with tenderness and help people grow. But to do that, it takes the strongest people in the community reaching out to the weakest people in the community. What we find is that when you gather a lot of strong people together, it's a really good experience. We often don't want to leave. It's like, I like hanging out with all these strong Christians. I just feel safe. I feel comfortable. But what happens is you only ever hang out with other strong Christians. After a while, you create a comfort zone and you never leave it. And after a while, you stagnate, and you're trying to figure out, why am I not growing as a Christian? Why am I not going to that next level? And a lot of times it's because I have stagnated because I've settled for the comfort zone that I'm in, because I only hang out with other strong Christians. If you are going to break through that comfort zone, you have to begin reaching out to the weak people among you. And there has to be a culture in which the weak and the strong interact on a regular basis in order for there to be growth, because the weak aren't going to grow unless the strong reach out to them, and the strong don't grow unless they're reaching out and helping the weak. And so it needs to be characteristic of our communities, but that isn't going to happen if our community and our culture is being run by predators. So we need to learn how to stand up to them. We need to build up the weak, and we need to learn to love our enemies. Now, those are some pretty heavy-duty goals, so let me kind of walk through these a little bit at a time. First of all, the model here is that belonging plus identity equals transformation. Talk about this in my book, Rare Leadership, that Jim and I wrote together, and that is that most discipleship models in the Western church don't say belonging plus identity equal transformation. They say information plus choice brings transformation. That is, let me give you some good information, you go out and make better choices, and your life will change. But we all know that rarely works. I can give people better information about how they ought to live their life, but their willpower to go and do that rarely turns somebody's life around. Now, it's not that it's worthless or there'd be no point in me talking to you this morning. There's some benefit to getting information along the way. But ultimately, did you ever notice that Jesus did not go and start an institute? When Jesus was going to launch his movement, he didn't start a school of philosophy. There's not, the Jesus Christ School of Philosophy in Athens, just down the road from Plato and Aristotle, where you can come and you can study and you can learn all of the biblical precepts that you need in order to be a godly person. Because if all we needed was good information, that's what Jesus would have done. He would have started an institute where you could go and get all of the information that you need. Now, there's nothing wrong with institutes, but institutes are there to support something bigger, something more important, something grander. And one thing that's bigger and more important and grander is the community. And he came to start a community and launch that community. In fact, I believe God has always lived in community. And God has always cared about Hesed. Consider this passage with me for a moment. Psalm 82. I've got it on my handy-dandy pocket Bible here, right? So it says a Psalm of Asaph. This is the ESV version, or the NIV version, I guess. It says, God presides in the great assembly, or Elohim presides in the divine council, and he renders judgment among the gods. Now, this passage has been grossly misunderstood. Let me try to give you some insights. The picture here is that God is the king over the universe, and the invisible God rules over all, and he is surrounded by a group called the Elohim, or the sons of Elohim, and they are the gods of the nations, and these are the principalities, powers, thrones, dominions, whatever. They are his divine council that surround him. And God has lived in this community. I find it very interesting. I mean, does God need a council? No, God doesn't need a council. God doesn't need a staff to run the universe. So why did he create a staff to run the universe? Why did he create this council? We see that at work in 2 Kings 22, or 1 Kings 22, for example, when Micaiah comes and proclaims judgment on Ahab. And we get a glimpse into this divine council that's in session. And Elohim says to all of them, I have decreed that Ahab should die in the upcoming battle. Who will lure him to his death? And one of the members says this, and one of the members says that, and another one says, I'll go be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. He says, go, you'll succeed. And I think that's interesting, because what's a lying spirit? It's a demon, right? So in other words, even the demons are subject to God on this council. And I don't fully grasp that, to be honest. It's like, are they still a part of that council? I don't know. But one thing I see is that God is, he rules over all, and he rules through this council. And as and this is the council we're getting a glimpse of on here, but listen to what he has to say to the gods of the nations. He says, how long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? He's saying, you that I've put in charge of the nations. He says, you are showing favoritism to the strong. And he says, you're being unjust. This is what I commanded you to do. I said, defend the weak and the fatherless. I told you to uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. I told you to rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. He said, these Elohim, they know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness, and all the foundations of the earth are shaken. Verse 6, Yahweh says, you are Elohim. You are all sons of El Elyon. But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. And I'm like, wow. It's like the penalty for being predatory instead of helping the weak. He told these Elohim, these gods, these beings that were so powerful, if we saw them, we'd probably be tempted to worship them. And God says, he said to these powerful beings, he says, because I gave you the world and you chose to side with the rich and the powerful and to oppress the poor and did not obey my command to look after the poor. He says, even though you are Elohim, you are going to die like mere men. This is what it says in 2 Peter as well. He says the elements someday will be burned up with fire. But that word elements doesn't mean elements like boron and chlorine and helium. That was the word stoicheia. And in Greek, that word means the elementary spirits of the world. It means the spirit beings that run the world. It's reaffirming this. It says there's a day of judgment coming on them, and they are going to die someday, and God is going to take them down. And while they were made to live forever, they're not. I'm like, wow, that is a pretty severe penalty. And what was the penalty for? Because God told them to build community. Instead of building community, they took advantage of the people, and they became predators within the people, and they used the people. And I'm like, God does not look kindly upon this. And so we look at this as Christian leaders, so we have to look out for predators, and we have to protect the flock. And honestly, I mean, even yesterday, I think there was a fellow here who came in from the outside, and I'm not sure that his intentions were all good. And I talked with him for a little while, and I left kind of shaken by the whole conversation. I was delighted to find later that some other people had a similar discernment and stepped in and moved in. I felt protected by that. I felt like here we have leaders who are willing to stand up and protect their flock. And that's why I say in order to have a safe place where people can belong, they got to know that their leaders are strong enough to stand up and keep them safe, and to protect them from things that shouldn't be coming into their environment. And I'm like, and it can be subtle, right? It can be subtle. And a lot of people, one of the key things that Paul talked about in his epistles over and over again was the danger of false brothers, false teachers, false apostles, and false prophets. Over and over again. Last thing he said to the church in Ephesus, where he'd spent 3 years of his life, he says, I know when I leave, wolves are going to rise up among you to devour the flock. So I'm leaving shepherds. Take them down. Keep this community safe. And we're keeping it safe from those who would infiltrate to take it in an ungodly direction. And he gave us some things to understand that. So we look at this and say, if I'm going to build belonging and identity, he said, then we need to have people who are willing to stand up to the predators. They have to protect the weak, create an environment that's way. And it also gets into how we who are strong in the community handle our problems becomes very important. So how we in the community handle our problems, and that is, do problems divide us, and how quickly do they divide us? And how good are we at keeping relationships bigger than problems as leaders within the church? Because you know what happens, don't you? Because belonging is such a powerful force. Let's just say that if Lael and I were up here, and Lael had one opinion and I had another opinion, and all of a sudden we couldn't seem to agree on that opinion, then guess what would happen? All the people who feel bonded to Lael would suddenly see the wisdom in what he was seeing. And all the people who felt bonded to me would suddenly see the wisdom in what I was seeing. And before you know it, the church would be splitting into camps. And it wouldn't even be splitting into camps over so much who you thought was right as just who you felt more bonded to. Who was your people? And we see this all of the time, don't we? That when leaders don't handle their problems well, when leaders don't find ways to keep their relationships bigger than their problems, churches split because people feel like they have to choose whose people they're going to be. And it's incumbent upon us that if we want our flock to be safe, we have to learn how to deal with our problems well. Let me just give you a couple of practical tools for dealing with some of these things. Number one has to do with the way you listen to people. And I'm going to use just a touch of brain science here. Left brain, right brain, okay? There is a left brain way to listen to people, and there's a right brain way to listen to people. And the difference is simply this. When I listen with my right brain, I'm listening for emotions that I can validate. With my right brain, I listen for emotions that I can validate. With my left brain, I listen for problems that need to be solved. So what happened here is in a lot of board meetings and a lot of executive meetings, we're talking about problems, aren't we? And because we're talking about problems, it's easy for us to shut down the right brain relational part of us and just become very problem focused. And as soon as I think I know what the solution to the problem is, I quit listening. I got this figured out. I know what the answer is. I know what the solution is. Let's just fix this problem. And we get so problem focused. And then it's like and if somebody else offers a different problem, now it's like, well, who's going to win? Which way are we going to do this? Your way or my way? Who's going to solve the problem better? And it all started because there has been no validation of one another's emotions in the meeting. Give you a couple of examples of this. I went to a church that had already split, and the pastor had had an affair with a female member of the staff and left. Not only did that have tremendous damage to the flock, but it turned out that between the two of them, they had signed their names to agreements that committed the church to $15 million in debt. Because they were the only two who were on every committee and the only two who knew what was going on and everything. And they were just so convinced that the church was just booming and booming and booming and it would be no problem. We'll just keep growing. And then they ended up in an affair together, and when they just about brought the whole church down. So do you think they have a problem that needs to get solved at this point? Yes. So we're sitting here with the elders of this body going, where do we go from here? But before we went, we took a moment and we did a little exercise, just went around the room. And I said, first of all, I want each of you to express to me, what is the dominant emotion that you are feeling about what happened to your church? And it was interesting, okay, because I kept waiting for somebody to say, I'm afraid. And no one, not one of them said, I'm afraid about the future of our church. That which kind of surprised me. But I got things like, I feel betrayed. I feel like I got sucker punched, right? I'm angry. I feel bitter. I had people like, I'm sad. I think I'm in grief. I feel like my church has been, taken away from me. I'm never going to have it again, and I'm grieving. And people went around, and it was interesting because now what's happening is people are right brain engaged. They're listening for people's emotions, and they're validating and said, I can understand feeling that way. I can understand feeling that way. And by establishing that foundation for the meeting, like, I understand you. I see where you're coming from. I understand that feeling. Problem solving gets a whole lot easier. But if you start with, okay, what's the problem that's got to get solved? Who thinks we have a solution to that problem? You can actually start the meeting in division. Well, I think we should solve it this way. I think we should solve it this way. I think we should solve it this way. It's like, right? And then the really strong people say, well, I'm going to, power up and I'm going to make sure we win. And the possum people play dead, said, I can't wait till this is over. Can't we all just get along? The motto of the possum leader is, I don't do conflict. But there's no such thing as not doing conflict if you're a leader. You have to do conflict. The question is, do you do conflict well? And the way that we do conflict well is by keeping relationships bigger than problems. And that starts by, one way we do that is making sure we are listening for the emotions and validating those emotions. Now, a simple process of validating an emotion is you name the emotion and how big it is. And you do it accurately. So when somebody says, I'm really grieving over what's happened to my church, it's just, and I think I have some anger and some bitterness too, and you say to them, so how big is that for you? When you say you feel bitterness and anger, is that like a level 8? Is it a level 9? And he goes, man, this is like sometimes it's a 10 and I just want to leave. And other times it's more like a 4, and I'm like, I just want to do something about it. See, and that helps me understand them, doesn't it? It helps me understand them. Now, on the other hand, if someone says, I am grieving and I am angry, and I say, oh, but you're scared, aren't you? I know you're scared. It's like, I'm not really validating at that point. I'm trying to, talk them into an emotion they may or not be having. Also, just because somebody has an emotion, validating doesn't mean you need to agree that they should be having that emotion. So validation doesn't mean, oh, I completely agree that you should feel that way. That is not validation, all right? That is agreement. So validation doesn't mean I agree that you should be feeling that way. Validation means you are in fact feeling that way, aren't you? That is in fact the emotion you're feeling, isn't it? That's validation. Now, we can do that in our marriages. We can do that with our kids. We can do that in all kinds of leadership places that we find ourselves. Validation is a very powerful tool. It's been one of the tools I think that has been most helpful in our marriage. It's been the power of validation and the understanding that I don't have to agree with an emotion in order to acknowledge that someone is in fact having that emotion. Can't tell you how many times, one of us would hear the other one express an emotion, and our first response is, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Right? That doesn't help, does it? I do feel this way. What am I supposed to do about it? So validation is an important tool. The other one is what we call an envelope or a sandwich conversation. The idea is when you have to talk about a problem, you put it in the envelope of relationship. Or another way of looking at this is you put that problem between two slices of relational bread. And this is different than say something positive before you say something negative. Because I've seen some parents who do this with their kids, and I watch, and it's kind of humorous because whenever they tell their kids something positive, the kid grimaces like, okay, I know it's coming. Because the only time they ever lead with the positive is when they want to make a really big point about the negative. Now, this isn't just say something positive before you say something negative. This is start with the history of your relationship, and then talk about the problem, and then talk about your hope for the future of the relationship. That I hope we can deal with this problem in a way that our relationship is even stronger moving forward than it's been in the past. Now you have to be careful about this because you can't talk about the past of our the history of our relationship should not be expressed as, well, throughout our history, you have always tried to undermine my authority, and you have always made problems for me, and you have always been a thorn in everybody's flesh around here. That is not a history of the relationship, right? A history of the relationship is you and I have known each other for about 4 or 5 years. We've worked on a lot of committees together. We've been through a lot of battles together. You and I, we have a history, don't we? That's it. I'm not trying to use my recitation of the history to win. I'm trying to use my history of the relationship to anchor what I'm about to say in relationship. I said, but here's a problem, and I'm concerned that if we don't deal with this problem well, our relationship is going to suffer, and I really want us to have a good relationship. Can we put our heads together and come up with a solution here where we'll have a better relationship moving forward than we do already? And then what you want to do is you're trying to give them a way where they can be a hero, right? You can be a hero in that setting by, well, I think I could come up with a solution that would do that. And these are some ways practical things that you can do to try to help keep problems from becoming bigger than relationships. And this is very important because if you don't, what will happen is good shepherd leaders are going to turn on each other if they don't learn how to do this stuff, and they will become predators. Because here's the king, everybody sitting in this room can be predatory. Because we all have that ability and that capacity to make winning more important than relating and loving. So we just have to be careful about all of this. All right, opposing predators, building the weak. As we build the weak with tenderness and with validation. I love this picture of Jesus looking at the little girl. And I'm thinking, when Jesus encountered the weak, did he ever blast them? No. Who did Jesus blast? Predatory leaders, right? The same kind of words that Yahweh had for the Elohim because of what they were doing is the same kind of words that Jesus had for the Pharisees for what they were doing to their flock. You know, some of the strongest, most powerful negative words God has in the Bible, when he has really taken somebody to task, it is almost always because he's asked them to be a leader, and instead of tending to the weak, they're hobnobbing with the rich and the powerful, and they're ignoring the weak and not taking care of them. It gets God angry at a level he doesn't seem to get as angry about anything else. And so we look at this, understand that part of Hesed community is learning to have that mindset that says, I am always looking for the weak, and I'm asking myself the question, who's getting left behind? Who's getting left out here? I'll give you an example. When I was a youth pastor, went down to a huge youth conference. There were about 3,000 kids at this youth conference, and we were at a big church. Took about 120 kids from our youth group there. And so I had a kind of a team meeting with our youth group before we got engaged with the conference. And I gave them the talk went something like this: is that you young people, you know that in every social setting you're in, there is a pecking order, right? Whether it's church, Whether it's school, whether it's sports, wherever it is, there is a pecking order. At the top of the pecking order are the powerful people. And they tend to be powerful because they're good looking, they're smart, they're high achievers, and they got money. So if you got money and you're good looking and you're high achieving, it's like, all you got to do is walk into a room and everybody's like, oh, it's you. So glad you're here. And it happens in church too, doesn't it? And so when that happens, and there are some people who are just kind of up at the top of the pecking order. And the natural thing for people at the top of the pecking order is to only care about the other people at the top. And the only thing that they care about is, am I impressing them? Am I okay with them? Do the other people recognize that I belong? And I just want to keep myself at the top and make sure that, and especially if I'm in a setting like this, because what happens at a youth conference is our pecking order shows up with 15 other pecking orders. And so the kids at the top of my pecking order are now comparing themselves with the top at their pecking order and saying, who's really the top dog here? Does any of that sound like the kingdom of God to you? Does Jesus talk about this? He said, whoever wants to be great among you in my kingdom must be the servant of all. He said, so this is what we're going to do this week. Okay, what we're going to do this week is you know who you are at the top of the pecking order. Your job is to look for people who are being left out. Your job is to make sure that none of our people get left out. If you see any of our kids who are younger than you, who aren't in the same social circles as you, but they're a part of our people, and you see them off to themselves, you see them not participating, you go grab them, you say, come hang out with me today. Let me introduce you to some people. Let's get you involved. I said, but our youth group needs to be a kingdom youth group, not a worldly youth group, because a worldly youth group is only interested in who's at the top of the pecking order and keeping the people at the bottom who belong there. And there's too many churches that operate this way. There is no difference between the way the church operates and the world operates in too many ways. So it's like if we are going to take the motto of the conference seriously, it's like kingdom living, putting it into practice, kingdom living, kingdom leadership. It starts with this idea of service that says I am less interested in where I'm at in my pecking order than I am in making sure that people aren't being left behind. Now, it takes more than one person to do that. A senior pastor of a church of even 150 can't always notice when someone hasn't shown up for 3 or 4 weeks. But it has to be a cultural value that somebody's going to notice. Hey, somebody's getting left behind. Somebody's not here. Somebody's not paying, not participating anymore. Well, somebody needs to reach out to this person. It becomes a culture. Too often when we become kingmakers, we're like, there's a problem here. I wonder why the pastor hasn't done anything about that. But we're all supposed to be doing that. So we look at this and say we want to be a community that builds the weak, and it also begins with validation, because when you listen to weak people talk, it's really easy to get fixated on their problems and misvalidating their emotions. Say, oh, you have this problem, you have this problem? Okay, well, here's what, and then let me give you some advice. I would fix your problem by doing this, 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 and this. Go have a good day. Before we start fixing people's problems, we have to learn how to validate their emotions. This is so important that I regularly, when I find myself like in doing a radio interview where there's going to be call-in, people calling in on the radio to talk to you, I put down on the pad of paper next to me every time, BCR, and the BCR is validate first. It's like validate first. Don't just, solve their problems. It's just very important in this. Another thing that we have to do as communities, if we're going to help our weak people grow strong, is something that Dr. Wilder calls Joy Camp and Joy Mountain. And Joy Camp and Joy Mountain help people build rhythm, they build skills. You think about it this way. If you're going to go with a group of friends and you're all going to go hiking or camping, let's say you're going to have like 3 days of camping at a state park or something like that, what's the first thing you do? So let's say we have 3 families together. There's like 8 kids. I mean, some of you there might be 15 kids. I don't know. We got 3 families together. You got a bunch of kids there. You got some teenagers with you. You got some grandparents along. And what's the very first thing you do? You set up camp, right? When you set up camp, you decide where you're going to put your food, where everybody's going to sleep, where the fire's going to be, and then you give ground rules. Here's the ground rules. The ground rules are, all right, kids, you got to stay in this clearing. You can play all you want. You got to stay in this clearing unless you're with an adult. Teenagers, you can go down to the lake, but that's as far as we're going to let you go. And all right, you older guys, you can just go enjoy. But we want everybody back by 8. All right? Everybody got it? Got the rules? Okay, on 3, break, go. It's like, go have a good time. Let's enjoy ourselves. And everything, and you go out there, and your day might be good, your day might be bad, right? You might get poison ivy, you might break a leg, you might, break a fingernail, you might catch a bunch of fish, you might see an elk, you might have, amazing, all kinds of things. Doesn't matter whether you have a good day, a bad day. What's going to happen throughout that day is you are going to be stretching yourself, stretching your capacity, learning new skills, growing, stretching, and then at the end of the day, you come back to Joy Camp and you got stories to tell. Whether you had a good day or a bad day, right? You had stories to tell. And everybody there is going to be, oh, yeah, and you relate and you bond and you build joy over the stories. And it's like, isn't that great? And at the end of the night, you all, you've worked hard, you've played hard, you've had good fellowship, and now it's time to rest. You have a little bit of that just at a conference like this, right? And what happens here is there is a rhythm that is established of, you start your day in Joy Camp, you go out onto Joy Mountain, and you do all these things, and you come back to Joy Camp. And when there's that rhythm to your life, it is sustainable. But if you don't have Joy Camp, and you don't have these places of rest in your life, and you're just pushing and pushing and pushing all the time, and you're the kind of leader that is always just pushing their people and pushing their people and pushing their people, you wear them out. And you wear yourself out, and it's non-sustainable. You're not going to be able to do this for a very long time. One of the things that really good leaders do is they make sure that everybody is getting the rest that they need. That's why I like the fact you start at 9:30. You got to make sure people get some rest here. And it's it's part of that. So what happens at the end of the day, and you come back to Joy Camp, it's 8 o'clock, and there's 2 people missing. What happens to the joy in Joy Camp? Right? There is no joy in Joy Camp until we go find those 2 people. Because we belong together. This is our community. Because there is belonging, we're going to go find them, even if they've been the biggest pain in the butt all day that we've had to deal with, right? We're going to go find them because they're our people. We got to make sure they're back, and we aren't going to feel okay until everyone's back. And that's kind of how church is supposed to operate. It's how our family's supposed to operate. This is kind of the rhythm that God's built into life. And as we do this, what happens is that the weak and the strong both go out onto the mountain together, and the weak and the strong come back and they rest together. And the weak and the strong go out on the mountain together, and the weak and the strong come back and rest together. And every now and then the strong will leave the weak behind and go do something by themselves to really push themselves and grow new skills. But that's once in a while. It's not all the time. And they come back. And you know what happens to weak people in a process like that? They don't stay weak. Before you know it, they've got the skills to do this now. And next time they go and there's somebody new, they become one of the guides, leading them on how we go. And that, to me, is what discipleship looks like. We help somebody who was weak know that they belonged. We help them grow an identity and a skill. We said, this is how you do it. Watch us. Do it with us. Watch how we do it. And after a while, they're able to turn around and say, hey, you're new here. Let me help you belong. This is the way we do things around here. Let me show you how we do it. And they begin to grow, and you just begin to take off, and the cycle just repeats. And that's why I think belonging and building community is the most powerful discipleship tool that we have. Finally get to this idea of loving your enemies. And I did not see Lael before I started. He was still making coffee. Is there another speaker after me this morning? No? Okay. I just wanted to know if how fast I needed to wrap up. Okay. I got another hour? Okay. Well, I don't have quite that much, so we'll get through. The loving our enemies. D.A. Carson was one of my professors in Trinity. I never actually had a class with him, but he was a professor at the school where I studied. And he had an interesting statement. He said, the church is a collection of natural enemies. And you think about it, you go back to the early church, and you had Jews and you had Greeks. It was hard enough to have Hebraic Jews and Hellenistic Jews getting together. They didn't really mix. But then you added full-fledged Greeks into this mix, and then you added Samaritans into this mix, and then you actually had some Pharisees and some tax collectors all in here together, right? I mean, you had a collection of natural enemies, and what was the number one thing Jesus said, by this all people will know that you're my disciples, is because you love one another. And so when he said love one another, and he said love your enemies, he was really saying the same thing. It's like, that's one of those things I've often heard pastors speculate on. It would have been fascinating to get a few more stories about how Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon the Zealot interacted in the discipleship group. But how many discipleship programs do you know of sets out and tells its people, the goal of our discipleship agenda is to help you learn to love your enemies? I've never heard it. Our goal here is to help you learn to love your enemies better. We hear things like, we want you to be more knowledgeable. We want you to be better grounded. We want you to learn to serve. We want you to learn to reach the lost for Christ. We want you to experience wholeness and healing in your life. We want you to have all these good things. I've never heard anybody say, our goal here is to help you suffer well and reach out to your enemies more effectively. And I asked Dr. Wilder about this, and he gave me an example. He said, well, he grew up in Colombia, South America, during an era called La Violencia. And the violence, La Violencia, he said the closest thing I can compare it to in modern history would be Rwanda, when the tribal people were just massacring others randomly. He said in the 10 years that he lived in Colombia, there were 250,000 murders. And when he was born and his parents wanted to decide where to put his crib, this was literally their conversation. Well, if we put him on this side of the room, he might get machine gunned. If we put him on this side of the room, they might toss a hand grenade in here. Right. They were missionaries in here, and there was one particular day where they found out that there was a band of guerrillas on one side of the village and a band of government people who were just as bad as the guerrillas coming from the other side. And they were both coming towards the village, and they got everybody into the church. And the dad went out there and had to mediate a peace. And interestingly enough, at the next service, a week later, little Jim, who was a little kid at that time, remembers looking up at a couple of the attendees, and he could see up underneath their ponchos that they had hand grenades and guns, strapped to their thing underneath this. And they noticed that there were people in that meeting who the week before had been lined up to kill each other. And they didn't know they didn't know that they were both in this same meeting together. I mean, it was a very tenuous situation. And so as soon as the service was done, the mom and the dad split up, and one of them talked to one to the rebel, the other one talked to the government official, and they just made sure they didn't meet. But eventually they both got saved, and they began attending the church. Now, what do you do in a church when you got people who wanted to kill each other 2 weeks ago, both attending? Saw the same thing down in Nicaragua. I was there with a short-term mission group. They asked me to preach one night, but I really wasn't the highlight of that event. That night, the pastor had 2 gangs had come forward to be baptized, rival gangs. And that night, the week before they had been baptized, and that night they both came forward and dropped all of their guns on the altar, and in exchange they were each given Bibles. I'm like, I'm not sure what I have to say to this. But now these natural enemies, we're going to learn how to love one another. And what we find here is that love, community, and belonging are going to go further to transforming their lives than any classes we can send them to. And so it's one thing to say, here, go get this conference material. Here, go listen to this, anointed preacher. It's another thing to say, come be a part of our community, and we will love you into transformation. That's a powerful, powerful picture, and it helped me understand this idea that we are called to learn to love our enemies. And I got to tell you, man, it's scary to love your enemies, right? Because you never know what they're going to do to you. Just last week I had lunch with a friend who is had a young man in his church who had been in the Middle East preaching, and while he had been in the Middle East, he just had a lot of fruit. You have to forgive me. Did I tell that story here? I told it here. Did it? Was it here? Okay, because sometimes I can't remember where I said which story. This guy, yeah, he's a guy who was arrested on his way out of this Middle Eastern country for preaching. Yeah, they were beating him, and Jesus said, "Do you know how much I love this guy?" Right? And I'm like, this idea of loving your enemies, man, I'm not really, it does not come naturally. It does not come naturally at all. When I see my enemies, I tend to either be afraid of them or mad at them or both. But it's also a matter of saying that as a community, do we have the kind of community that can bring people in who are not like us and welcome them in such a way that by becoming part of our community, their life changes and goes in another direction? I think that's one of the more powerful elements of discipleship that some of us overlook. I know I have. We talked to a friend who was put in prison. He had a double life sentence. And he came and spoken at one of our Deeper Walk events. He got a double life sentence because he had taken 2 guns and emptied the clips into somebody. Boom, 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 boom. The guy miraculously lived. I don't know how the guy lived. But it wasn't even really a gang thing. It was just a very tough inner city neighborhood thing. And he got arrested. He got sentenced to double life imprisonment. When he was there, his first night in prison, this older white guy came by with a shoebox, didn't make eye contact, just dropped the shoebox in front of him and kept walking. And this dude was Hispanic, and he was tough. He was from a very tough neighborhood. And he took a look in this box, and inside there was a pamphlet about Jesus. There was toothpaste, there was a comb, there was a toothbrush, there was soap. And I don't fully grasp all this, but he said, my first thought when I got this is, now I got to kill him. Now, I got to ask him, I said, you're going to have to help me with that. Why was that your first response? He says, because where I'm from, you can't owe anybody anything, and I had no way to repay this guy. So I couldn't have debt. I got to kill him. So he decided, I'll just get it over with. And that night, he walked down to the guy's cell, planning to kill him. And when he walked in there were 5 people having a Bible study. And so he said, well, I guess I can't kill him now. And he waited, and they gave him a pamphlet and said, hey, come back and join us some other time. He went back to his room, he read that pamphlet, and he gave his life to Christ. Next time he showed up there, it wasn't to kill the guy, it was to become part of the group. And here's somebody who'd come to kill him the week before, who's now coming to be discipled the next week. And they formed a tight-knit band, and they belonged, right? In a very hostile environment like a prison, these people belonged, and they had each other. And the transformation in this guy's life was so profound that over the next few years, he became like Joseph in that prison. He was entrusted by the guards with all kinds of responsibilities in the prison. The guards recommended him for parole, even though his sentence had been double life imprisonment with no chance for parole. When we met him, he had been paroled. And he was a manager for a coffee bean company called the Second Chance Coffee Company that hired ex-felons to give them a second chance. And this guy was making the most of it. One of the things that he said was interesting. He said, when I was in prison, the belonging and the fellowship were so intense and so wonderful that when I came to the first church, I expected the same thing. I came to church and I thought I was going to get the same kind of community, that people were going to say, oh, welcome, we're glad you're here. But people didn't go, welcome, we're glad you're here. They said, stay away from my kids. They're like, don't you get too close. And they tolerated him just long enough till he finally left. Right? And it would happen to church after church after church. And he goes, what's going on with the church? Why do I have to go to prison to find Christian fellowship? Now, again, we don't want to sacrifice our children to predators, but we have to figure out here, how are we going to do this? What does this look like? And that means we got to have some strong, godly men who can befriend somebody like this when they show up, so that he's got a group of people that he belongs to that are happy to see him, that can have a connection with him, that can help him grow. But if your church doesn't have that, you're kind of stuck. And that's why I say our vision for kingdom discipleship, our vision for kingdom work, is we want to become the type of community that is creating this type of environment, that is creating this type of Christians, because then you know what you send out in missions? You send out people who are like, well, this is just how you do church. And now they know this is just how you do church. This is how you love your enemies. I've seen this 100 times. I've seen my people do this a dozen times. So now they're ready to go out there and they're ready to replicate that. But you know what most of our missionaries are out there replicating? Here, let me give you this 3-ring binder that you can take notes in, and I'll give you all of the information that you need to be a good Christian. Is that discipleship? Again, not evil. Nothing wrong with that. But it's not the same thing, is it? And there's a role for it, but if that's our view of discipleship, it is never going to create the kind of transformation that we're after. And it isn't going to create the kind of heart change that people look at and say, man, this guy used to be one way, but look at the transformation in his life now. And I believe that God wants us to be something, that church that moves beyond discipleship. So if you're looking for some extra resources on this, let me end. Chris Corsi is a friend of mine. We're about to write a book together on marriage. And he's got one called Transforming Fellowship, and this is focusing on what are the skills that you can only learn in community, right? That you can't just sit down and read a book and learn these skills. You got to do them in community. He's got a good book on help you get started on what he calls the 19 brain skills and that have to be learned in relationship with other people. And then my core book on discipleship is Toward a Deeper Walk. If you're looking for a place to start with people, I recommend this one as a starting point for walking them through places. But again, my purpose here isn't primary to sell books. I mean, it does help our bottom line, of course, but our primary purpose here is to equip the saints to see us all engaged in building the kind of Hesed communities where it's okay for leaders to be weak, but growing. It's okay for me to share my weakness and know that you will help me grow when I do that. We have too many communities where if I share my weakness, I become a target. And because of that, people learn not to. It's like if I were to have open mic right now, say, everybody come up and share your greatest struggle in your life with the group right now. You know why that might not be a good idea? Probably because maybe not everybody in here has the maturity to handle that. But that doesn't mean that you don't find some people who need to know where you're struggling and what the weakness is. There needs to be somebody in your community you can talk to about these things. Because people have different levels and different strata of emotional capacity. It reminds me of the story about the 3 pastors who decided to form an accountability group. And they got together and the first pastor said, well, I got to admit that I've lost a lot of money gambling on horses. And the second pastor, well, I got to admit that I've bought a few too many porn magazines in my life. And third pastor says, well, I got to admit I got a real problem with gossip. So So when I'm sharing my weakness with people, I'm looking for a couple of qualities in that person. One is I don't want to share it with a gossip. And as Christians, we've really refined the process because gossip in our circles is called a prayer request. So we need to be careful. It's like there are some things that you're told, and the reason that people tell you is that they think that you've got the emotional capacity to handle the weight of what they're about to share with them, what they're about to share with you. They're hoping you have the emotional capacity to handle the weight of what they're about to share and be tender towards it and be helpful with it and not use it as a point of destruction against them. Now, it doesn't mean there's no consequences. Somebody says, hey, I killed somebody. You're like, well, that's pretty big. I'll give you an example. My next door neighbor was having some issues, and his son, like 8-year-old, came and knocked on my front door. He's like, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner. I said, what? He said, my dad, he's kicking in my mom's head. I'm scared, come. I have to walk next door and knock on the door. He lets me in. I walk in there, and there's holes in the wall, lady on the floor, and I look at him and said, I think you need to come with me. And he walked with me next door, and she'd already called the police. And I'm just sitting here going, what am I going to do with this guy for the 20 minutes while we're waiting for the police to come? Now, you got to understand, this was one of the most mild-mannered, quiet Christian men I knew. And we had delightful conversations, on the front lawn together. And I looked at him, I said, it's been my experience that when somebody snaps like this, they've seen somebody else snap like this. I said, you ever seen anybody else snap and beat their wife? He hung his head. He said, yeah, my dad. Saw him do it to my mom. And he goes, yeah, she would just poke and poke and poke and poke, and I finally snapped, and he said, I regret it, nothing I can do about it. And I said, well, just want you to know God understands. God still loves you, and he'll walk with you through this. If there's anything I can do to help, I'm here. Now, what I didn't do was, well, keep the police from getting you. Go hide out in the basement, right? Now, there were still consequences to what he had done, but I was with him and relational while they put the handcuffs on, while they took him out. I wrote out my statement of what my experience had been. You do your best to stay relational in there because he's hoping that you've got the weight, you've got the capacity to handle this weight without it becoming now I have to go around and tell everybody in the neighborhood what just happened, right? Oh, you're never going to believe what just happened. And I've got to share it as a prayer request to everybody. In fact, I only tell it now because none of you probably ever going to have any interaction with it, but it's these kind of things is what people are looking for. They're looking for people who've got some capacity to handle these things. And that's what maturity looks like. So when you're looking around the room and you're looking for somebody who's mature, you're not necessarily looking for the most gifted person in the room. You're not necessarily looking for the one who is the most flamboyant, right? You're looking for the person who can handle the most weight. Who can handle the weight and still be themselves, help you find yourself, and bring some restoration to this process. And blessed is the church that's got a bunch of these people in it, right? Because the more that we have maturity in our church, the more that we're going to be able to help the weak grow into the full maturity of the kingdom responsibilities that God has for them. And that's my prayer for each of you. And as we go forward from this place, we will commit ourselves to becoming those kind of mature people who are integral parts of building mature communities that are learning how to raise up the weak people, oppose predators, and learn how to love our enemies well. Let's pray. Father God, it's been a good conference in a lot of ways. You met with us at a lot of different levels and a lot of different places. I just ask you to meet with us again. A lot of us are tired, and maybe what we need right now is rest. But I pray that you'll give us some rest to let some of these things digest, to let them sink in. And Lord, if there's any here who said, you know what, I've been pretending to be stronger than I am, I just pray that you'll give them the space right now to bring that weakness to you. Say, God, I confess I've been pretending to be way stronger than I am. And I encourage you, that's you. that you ask the Lord to tell you 2 people in your life who have the maturity to handle hearing that. 2 people in your life have the maturity to handle hearing that. Because you can't keep it to yourself and be all alone in it. Because we're not spiritual supermen. We're part of a family. And Lord, I just pray that you will orchestrate these things for our benefit. Take what the enemy means for evil, use it for good. And guide us as we seek to overcome evil with good. In Christ's name, amen.